What would you do if a child you had never met knocked on your door and asked, "Can you take me to mommy?" For Graham Ellis, a wealthy CEO who lived his life in silence and routine, that question cracked open a world he thought was forever locked away. On an ordinary foggy morning in Portland, a little girl with mismatched boots and a worn-out teddy bear changed everything. Her trust was simple, her courage was quiet, but her presence reshaped the life of a man who thought he had nothing left to give. This is not just a story about wealth or loneliness. It is about how love sometimes arrives, uninvited, dressed in a red coat, 2 sizes too big, and shows us that family can be found in the most unexpected places. Stay with us and subscribe to the Retold Stories for more tales that will touch your heart. The mornings on Cedar Ridge Lane were always wrapped in stillness, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if the street itself had agreed not to disturb the world until the sun insisted. For Graham Ellis, this silence was not just routine, it was sanctuary. Every day began the same: a leather briefcase waiting by the door, a wool coat folded neatly over his arm, and the tick of his silver watch reminding him of the endless loop of meetings, contracts, and numbers that shaped his existence. He was a man who lived in precision. The marble floors of his home echoed only with the sound of polished shoes, the hum of appliances, and occasionally the whisper of his own measured breath. He thought of it as control, though in truth, it was loneliness carefully disguised. But that morning, something broke through the pattern. Just as the lock clicked shut behind him, a voice small, high, but steady cut through the mist. "Excuse me, sir. Can you take me to mommy?" The sound froze him. Graham turned, and what he saw jarred him more than any hostile boardroom takeover ever could. At his gate stood a little girl, perhaps 5 or 6, swallowed by a red coat, at least 2 sizes too large. Her boots were mismatched, her curls wild, her cheeks flushed with the cold. A tattered teddy bear drooped from her tiny hand, its fur worn thin from years of love. She looked up at him with eyes that did not plead or beg, they simply expected, as though help was not a possibility, but a certainty. For a moment, Graham could not breathe. His life had been structured to keep out surprise, yet here she was, an interruption wrapped in innocence. He gripped the house key tighter, his knuckles whitening. "Where's your mother?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "She went with the ambulance last night," the child replied matter-of-factly. "I woke up and she wasn't there. I waited, but it got lonely. Mommy says people with jobs help people without cars. You have a job, right?" The logic was simple, almost painfully so. Graham, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals, found himself speechless before a little girl with a teddy bear. "I don't even know you," he muttered. She pointed across the street to a dilapidated brick building with crooked blinds. "I live there. My name's Maddie. You're the man in the fancy house." Her words unsettled him. He was used to being described by titles CEO, investor, chairman, but never simply as the man in the fancy house. He reached for his phone, mumbling, "I should call someone." "No need," Maddie interrupted, pulling a slightly crumpled card from her pocket. The logo of St. Mercy's Medical Center glared up at him. Her hand shook slightly, though her voice remained steady. "That's where Mommy Island, please. It's just me. I don't want to go alone. Elevators are scary." Something cracked inside him, though he could not name it. Perhaps it was the quiet certainty in her tone, or the trust with which she slipped her small hand into his. Her fingers were warm against his cold palm, and before he had time to think, he was leading her toward the black SUV parked at the curb. As they walked, he felt eyes from behind curtains, neighbors peeking through blinds. He ignored them, focusing only on the tiny figure at his side. Her teddy bear swung with each step, a soft counterpoint to the fog curling around their ankles. When he opened the passenger door and helped her into the seat, she smiled up at him. "Thanks, what's your name again?" "Graham," he answered, his voice low, almost reluctant. "Okay, Mr. Graham, let's go find Mommy." He closed the door gently, stood still for a heartbeat, then slid into the driver's seat. As the engine hummed to life, he felt something inside himself short-circuit. The autopilot of his carefully managed world had been turned off. The drive to St. Mercy's was only 15 minutes, but to Graham, it felt like crossing into another universe. Maddie sat quietly in the back, her teddy tucked under her chin. She did not chatter, did not cry. She simply watched the city roll by with the stillness of someone who had learned early how not to take up space. Graham stole glances at her in the rear-view mirror, her wide eyes reflecting more resilience than any child should need. When his phone buzzed Singapore first, then Zurich, he ignored it. The calls kept flashing, vibrating against the console like urgent whispers from his old life. For once, he let them pass unanswered. At the hospital, Maddie climbed out before he could even open her door. She marched toward the entrance, clutching her teddy like a soldier heading into battle. Graham followed, his long strides strangely tentative, as if he were intruding on sacred ground. Inside, the antiseptic scent was sharp, sterile. At the reception desk, Maddie lifted her chin. "We're here for Rachel Harper. She's my mommy." The receptionist glanced at Graham. "And you are?" Before he could answer, Maddie said simply, "He's helping. We don't have a car." The woman softened, tapping at her keyboard. "Rachel Harper, ICU, respiratory failure." She paused, her eyes flicking to Maddie, then back to Graham. "No emergency contact, no insurance." Graham felt Maddie's small hand slip back into his. He didn't pull away. "I'll sign whatever you need," he heard himself say. When asked for his relationship to the patient, he hesitated only briefly, before answering, "Friend." The word felt strange on his tongue. He had associates, colleagues, partners, but friend? That was new. Led down a dim hallway, they entered the ICU. Rachel lay pale and unconscious against white sheets, wires and tubes tracing fragile lines across her body. The beeping machines filled the silence with their mechanical rhythm. Maddie tiptoed forward, placing her teddy beside her mother's arm. "Hi, Mommy," she whispered. "I found someone to help me. His name is Mr. Graham. He lives in the house with the shiny gate. Remember?" Graham stood still, something tightening in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about contracts or profits. He was thinking about a child's faith, a mother's fragile breath, and the unexpected way both had just rewritten his life. The ride back from the hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed into Graham's chest in a way he had never felt before. Maddie sat in the back seat, her small boots thudding softly against the leather as she swung her legs. She wasn't restless. She wasn't afraid. She was simply present, humming a faint tune that seemed to belong to her alone. Graham kept his eyes on the road, though he caught himself glancing at her in the mirror more often than was necessary. He wondered how many mornings this child had already faced without certainty, how many nights she had fallen asleep with only that ragged teddy bear for comfort. The thought lingered, and with it, something else began to stir, a sense of responsibility he hadn't invited but couldn't push away. When they arrived at her apartment building, the contrast to his own home was stark. The air inside the hallway smelled faintly of bleach mixed with stale bread, the paint chipped along the stairwell, children's drawings taped to the walls with corners curling. Maddie skipped ahead with an ease that suggested this was nothing unusual, her red coat flaring behind her like a cape. She stopped at a faded green door with the number 2B hanging crooked and slid a small key into the lock. "This is it," she chirped. The moment Graham stepped inside, he was struck by the scent. It was a blend of flour, cocoa, and something faintly musty, the kind of smell that belonged to places well lived in. The apartment was small, barely 500 square feet, but it was filled with traces of life. Drawings taped to the fridge, folded laundry stacked neatly on a chair, and a row of mason jars labeled flour, sugar, and cocoa sitting proudly on the counter. Maddie rushed to the shelf and announced, "This is Mommy's cupcake station." She spoke with the pride of someone giving a grand tour, her smile unbothered by the chipped countertops or the patched window rattling with the wind. Graham followed slowly, each detail weighing heavier than the last. A cracked notebook lay open on the table, words scribbled in block letters. "Rent due. Call Mrs. Vega. Pick up medicine." He swallowed hard. It was a world far from polished marble floors and imported wine, yet it carried a warmth his own house had never known. Maddie darted into her small bedroom, dragging him along to show a string of fairy lights taped to the wall, a shelf crowded with well-worn books, and a crayon drawing of a cake she wanted to bake for her mother's birthday. Her voice grew quiet as she admitted they never had the right pan. He found himself kneeling beside her when a cupcake slipped from the counter and landed on the floor. She picked it up tenderly, brushing it as though it were precious glass. "These were supposed to be for the neighbors," she whispered, "but we ran out." Graham took one of the remaining cakes when she offered it. It was dense, imperfect, a little dry, but there was something else baked into it, care, effort, love, that tried its hardest even when resources were thin. He chewed slowly, something in his chest tightening. The hours that followed blurred. Maddie led him through the apartment as though it were a palace, her pride shining through every chipped wall and makeshift repair. He listened quietly, noticing the way she smoothed a blanket on the couch where she sometimes slept, the way her small hands moved with practiced responsibility far beyond her years. Each detail cut deeper into him than any sharp word ever had in a boardroom. When the afternoon light faded, Maddie tugged at his hand. "Mommy might miss me if I don't go back tonight," she said softly. So he locked the apartment door, her tiny fingers laced in his, and drove her once more to St. Mercy's. They walked the sterile hallway together, and though Graham had no reason to stay, he found himself reluctant to leave. That night, Maddie fell asleep in his car, her head resting against the seat, Teddy tucked under her arm. By the time they returned to Cedar Ridge Lane, the fog had thickened. Graham carried her across the pristine marble of his foyer, her weight so light it startled him. He laid her gently on the guest bed, pulling a blanket over her small frame. She stirred only once, whispering, "You don't smile much." He blinked, caught off guard. "No, I suppose I don't." She turned her head slightly. "But you make me feel safe anyway." The words stayed with him long after she drifted back into sleep. The following days unfolded differently than any Graham had ever known. His house, once immaculate and echoing with silence, began to collect signs of life. Maddie's drawings appeared on his refrigerator, taped proudly beside sleek magnets. Once reserved for invitations and business cards, crayon hearts and stick figures replaced the sterile emptiness. Pancakes were made in a kitchen that had rarely seen more than catered meals. A child's laughter began to fill the spaces that had once been suffocating with quiet. Neighbors who had once only nodded at Graham from a distance now peeked curiously from their windows, surprised to see the once untouchable CEO walking hand in hand with a little girl in a yellow raincoat. His routine changed in ways that startled him. The treadmill was replaced with grocery store trips where Maddie insisted on choosing the good kind of syrup. Conference calls were ignored, not because he forgot, but because something else mattered more. One evening, as he returned from the hospital, he found Maddie in the living room, coloring with both her old teddy and the new bunny he had bought her sitting by her side. She looked up and grinned. "This one's for you," she announced, holding up a picture of 3 figures under a lopsided house. "That's me, that's Mommy, and that's you, our family." He didn't know how long he stood staring at it, the paper, fragile in his hands. For the first time in years, the silence in his house didn't feel heavy. It felt full. And with each passing day, Graham realized he wasn't just helping a child find her mother. He was finding something himself, something he hadn't known he was missing, something he wasn't sure he deserved, but something he could no longer live without. When Rachel Harper finally opened her eyes, the entire world seemed to shift. Graham had been sitting in the ICU waiting room, Maddie curled against him, her small frame heavy with sleep. The beeping of machines in the distance had become a part of his own heartbeat, steady yet uncertain. Then a nurse appeared, her smile soft as she whispered, "She's awake." Maddie bolted from his arms and into the hospital room, her voice breaking into the silence. "Mommy!" Rachel's face lit up faintly despite her weakness, her hand trembling as she reached for her daughter. Graham lingered in the doorway, uncertain if he belonged. But when Rachel's eyes met his, filled with gratitude deeper than words, he stepped forward. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. "She needed someone," Graham answered. "She found the right one," Rachel replied, her gaze shifting to Maddie clinging to her side. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment. Not romantic, Not yet. But human, and raw, and real. Days became weeks. Rachel's health returned slowly, her breaths steadier, her steps more certain. When the doctors agreed she could leave, it was not to the crumbling apartment above the laundromat, but to a freshly painted cottage behind Graham's home. The space smelled faintly of vanilla and fresh paint, sunlight streaming through wide windows. Rachel paused in the doorway, astonished. "You did all this?" she asked softly.
He shrugged, almost embarrassed. It was mostly Tessa. I just pointed at catalogs and panicked about candles. For the first time since he met her, Rachel laughed, a laugh fragile yet sincere.
Life began to take shape in ways neither had expected. Rachel filled the kitchen with the scent of cocoa and sugar again, though now it was by choice rather than survival. She called her new venture Harper's Hope, a name Graham insisted belonged to her alone. He supported quietly, never overstepping, allowing her to feel ownership in a way she had once feared she would lose. Maddie thrived in the midst of this new rhythm. She skipped to school with her yellow raincoat flapping behind her, carried a pink backpack Graham had chosen with far too much care, and decorated his refrigerator daily with new drawings. The once sterile mansion transformed. Pancake mornings became routine, bunny slippers found their way under the couch, and bedtime stories replaced late-night stock. Reports. Even the housekeeper noticed, telling Graham one morning as she watched him slice strawberries into heart shapes, "You're not the same man I used to work for." Graham only smiled quietly in response. Because she was right. There were nights when Rachel would sit on the porch with him, Maddie asleep inside, and their conversations stretched longer than either intended. She spoke about the struggles of raising Maddie alone, about nights when bills outweighed food, about the fear of leaving her daughter without anyone. Graham, in turn, admitted things he had never said aloud. That his wealth had insulated him, but never satisfied him. That silence had become less a choice and more a prison. The honesty between them grew like something fragile yet undeniable. One evening, Maddie, with her usual bluntness, looked at him across the dinner table and said, "You're kind of like a dad." The words stopped him cold. He glanced at Rachel, who said nothing but whose eyes shone with something softer than gratitude. In that moment, Graham realized what he had been trying not to admit. He didn't just care for Maddie. He belonged to her, and to Rachel, in ways he could no longer deny. Quietly, without fanfare, he met with a lawyer downtown. Papers were drawn up, not about corporations or properties, but about guardianship, medical rights, and protections for Rachel and Maddie. When everything was signed and official, he slid the document across Rachel's kitchen table. She stared at the legal jargon, her lips trembling. "You did this for us? For you?" he said simply. "For her." Tears filled her eyes, but her voice was steady. "That scares me sometimes," she admitted. "It scares me too," he replied, reaching for her hand. "But it feels right." The nights no longer ended in silence. They ended in laughter, in drawings taped to the fridge, in Maddie's voice announcing proudly, "This is our person," whenever she introduced Graham to someone new. Their bond deepened not with declarations, but with the quiet consistency of love showing up every day. There was a morning when the rain fell gently across Cedar Ridge Lane, and Graham helped Maddie into her jelly bean yellow raincoat. She looked up at him, eyes wide, and whispered, "I'm glad I knocked on your door." He froze, kneeling to her level as the street blurred around them. "You didn't just knock," he whispered back. "You kicked it wide open." She threw her arms around his neck, and for the first time, Graham held her as if letting go would never be an option. Later that evening, after Maddie had gone to bed, Graham walked into his office. The room had once been the heart of his empire, filled with silence and contracts. Now, it held something else. On the desk sat a photograph Maddie had taken with a cheap disposable camera. It was blurry, off-center, but full of life. Rachel laughing, Maddie mid-spin in her yellow coat, and Graham holding her bunny like it was something sacred. Across the top, in clumsy handwriting, Maddie had scrawled, "Our family forever." Graham stared at it for a long time, then sat at the desk, not to sign a deal, but to write himself a note. A reminder that sometimes love does not arrive politely. Sometimes it shows up in the rain, wearing a red coat, clutching a teddy bear, asking to be walked to mommy. And when it does, the only thing left to do is open the door. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest questions. For Graham Ellis, a man who believed his life was already written in the ink of contracts and schedules, it began with a little girl's whisper, "Can you take me to mommy?" That moment, so small on the surface, became the spark that unraveled years of silence and replaced it with laughter, warmth, and something he had never dared to imagine: family. We often think love must arrive with fireworks, that transformation comes in grand gestures or sweeping changes. But the truth is quieter, more delicate. It comes in the trust of a child slipping her hand into yours without hesitation. It comes in a smile shared between two people who realize they are no longer strangers but companions on the same journey. It comes in cupcakes baked from scratch in a cramped kitchen, in drawings taped proudly on a refrigerator, in the soft sound of rain against windows while someone hums a lullaby in the next room. Graham's story is not just about wealth or charity or chance. It is about what happens when we allow ourselves to be interrupted, when we let down the walls we built around our hearts. For years, he lived in a house that was polished but empty, perfect but hollow. And then Maddie arrived, dragging her teddy bear, mismatched boots, and unwavering courage. She filled the silence with color, with faith, with the gentle reminder that love is not something we earn, it is something we choose to accept. Rachel's journey, too, was one of resilience. She had faced hardship with quiet strength, raising her daughter with whatever she had, even when it wasn't enough. Her recovery was not just physical but emotional, a step toward believing that she did not have to carry everything alone. Together, she and Graham discovered that healing doesn't just come from medicine. It comes from presence, from showing up day after day, from daring to hope again. And Maddie, small, fearless Maddie, was the bridge between them. She reminded them both that family is not always about blood or tradition. Sometimes it is about the people who choose to stay, the ones who open their doors and their hearts when no one else does. As the rain fell softly over Cedar Ridge Lane and Graham helped Maddie into her jelly bean yellow raincoat, it was clear that their lives had changed forever. They were no longer three separate souls surviving in isolation. They had become a family, messy, imperfect, but real. If this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you that love can appear in unexpected places and that new beginnings are possible, even after long seasons of loneliness, then stay with us. Subscribe to the Retold Stories for more tales that move the heart, stir the soul, and remind us that even on the darkest mornings, tomorrow can bring light. Because sometimes, all it takes to change everything is one small knock on the door.